He thought humiliating a quiet woman in front of the entire executive board would make him look powerful. But within the next 10 minutes, the CEO would walk into that glass conference room and freeze every person inside it into silence. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe to the channel and help support more stories like this. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us keep bringing you powerful stories about dignity, justice, and the people the world underestimates. The 32nd floor of Hale Dynamics overlooked downtown Chicago like a kingdom built from steel and glass. Morning sunlight reflected across polished marble floors, while executives in tailored suits moved through the corridors carrying tablets, coffee cups, and the quiet tension that always came before quarterly review meetings. Inside Conference Room Atlas, the atmosphere already felt heavy. A massive digital screen glowed at the front of the room, displaying operational reports and financial projections, while department heads settled into leather chairs around the long black conference table. At exactly 8:55 a.m., Brandon Pierce entered the room with the confidence of a man who believed authority alone made him untouchable. At 46, the operations director carried himself with calculated precision. His navy Italian suit fit perfectly, his silver watch gleamed beneath the recessed lighting, and his sharp jaw remained locked in the permanent expression of someone who enjoyed making others uncomfortable. Employees at Hale Dynamics respected Brandon publicly, but privately, most feared him. He had built his reputation by humiliating people in meetings, exposing mistakes with theatrical cruelty, and reminding everyone beneath him exactly where they stood. And this morning, he had already chosen his target. Evelyn Carter quietly entered the conference room carrying a slim gray laptop and a stack of printed audit reports. Unlike everyone else in the room, she wore no expensive designer labels. Her soft gray cardigan and modest navy skirt made her look almost invisible beside the executives surrounding the table. At 39, Evelyn moved carefully, professionally, avoiding attention whenever possible. Most employees barely noticed her outside compliance meetings. That was exactly how she preferred it. Brandon glanced at her the moment she sat near the far end of the table. His eyes narrowed slightly. He remembered what had happened 3 days earlier, when Evelyn had calmly questioned inconsistencies in one of his operational reports during a smaller finance review. She hadn't embarrassed him publicly then. But in Brandon's mind, simply challenging him at all was unforgivable. The room gradually filled with low conversation, keyboard clicks, and the soft hum of the city beyond the towering windows. Then Brandon stood up slowly at the head of the table and adjusted his cufflinks. The room fell silent immediately. "Let's begin," he said coldly. His voice carried the kind of authority that made junior employees straighten in their seats. Charts appeared on the screen behind him as he walked through productivity numbers and distribution metrics with polished confidence. Every word sounded rehearsed, every movement deliberate. Evelyn listened quietly while taking notes. Her expression remained calm, though her eyes occasionally lingered on certain numbers flashing across the screen. Numbers that didn't match the original compliance logs she had reviewed the night before. Brandon noticed her looking, and suddenly, a faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. The trap had already been set. "Actually," Brandon said casually, pausing mid-presentation as he turned toward the far end of the table. "Before we continue, perhaps Ms. Carter would like to explain why she's been questioning executive-level reports she clearly doesn't understand." The room instantly became still. Several executives exchanged uncomfortable glances. Evelyn slowly looked up from her notes. Brandon leaned both hands against the conference table, his voice sharpening. "Go ahead, Evelyn," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "since you seem to believe you know better than operations leadership." And just like that, every eye in the room turned toward the quiet woman in the gray cardigan. Evelyn could feel the weight of every executive's stare pressing against her from across the conference table, but unlike most people Brandon Pierce targeted, She did not panic. She simply closed her notebook slowly and folded her hands beside it while the giant screen behind Brandon continued glowing with operational forecasts and performance metrics. Outside the towering windows, downtown Chicago shimmered beneath the pale winter sunlight, but inside Conference Room Atlas, the atmosphere had turned sharp enough to cut through steel. Brandon straightened his posture, enjoying the silence he had created. He had always believed fear was the fastest way to control a room. "Well," he asked, his tone dripping with condescension, "you seemed very confident when questioning my department's reports earlier this week." A few executives shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs. Nobody wanted to become collateral damage once Brandon started publicly dissecting someone. Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the screen behind him. "I was only reviewing the audit trail," she answered calmly. Her voice remained soft, almost gentle. That only irritated Brandon more. He had expected nervousness, apologies, maybe even embarrassment. Instead, Evelyn spoke with quiet composure, as though his authority did not intimidate her at all. "The audit trail?" Brandon repeated with a short laugh. "You are a compliance support coordinator, Evelyn, not senior leadership." The words echoed through the room. Near the far wall, a junior analyst lowered his gaze toward his laptop, pretending not to listen. Everyone inside Hale Dynamics knew what happened to employees Brandon considered disloyal. Careers stalled. Promotions disappeared. Meetings became public executions disguised as performance reviews. Brandon slowly paced beside the conference table, rolling a presentation clicker between his fingers. "Perhaps you should explain to everyone here exactly what qualifies you to challenge executive operations reporting." Evelyn hesitated for only a moment. "The numbers from the warehouse distribution logs do not match the finalized report submitted last Thursday," she said carefully. Several heads turned toward Brandon. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but then he smiled again, colder this time. "Interesting," he replied. "And somehow you believe you discovered an error that my entire operations division missed." The room remained completely silent. Evelyn could hear the low hum of the ventilation system above them and the faint clink of ice from someone's untouched glass of water. "I believe the original files may have been modified," she answered. The reaction was immediate. One executive stopped typing. Another slowly leaned back in his chair. Brandon's expression hardened so quickly it almost seemed to crack beneath the fluorescent lights. He walked toward Evelyn until he stood directly across from her side of the table. "Do you understand what you are implying?" he asked quietly. That tone frightened people more than shouting ever could. Evelyn looked up at him steadily. "I am saying the timestamps do not align with the archived records." Brandon let out a sharp breath through his nose and turned toward the rest of the room with theatrical disbelief. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "This is exactly what happens when employees overstep roles they barely understand." A few nervous chuckles scattered weakly around the table before dying almost immediately. Nobody wanted to fully side with him anymore. Something about Evelyn's calmness unsettled them. Brandon noticed it too, and it infuriated him. He pressed a button on the remote, enlarging the quarterly numbers across the massive screen behind him. "Let me make something very clear," he said loudly. "Operational leadership at this company is not dictated by clerical staff with access to spreadsheets." Evelyn remained seated, her expression never changed. "I was not trying to challenge leadership," she said quietly. "I was trying to prevent inaccurate reporting from reaching the board." The room went still again. Brandon froze for half a second. It was subtle. Most people would not have noticed it. But for the first time that morning, the operations director no longer looked completely in control. For a long moment, nobody inside Conference Room Atlas spoke. The giant digital screen continued glowing behind Brandon Pierce, while lines of financial projections reflected faintly across the polished black conference table. Chicago traffic crawled far below the towering glass windows, but up on the 32nd floor of Hale Dynamics, the silence felt heavy enough to stop the entire building. Brandon slowly loosened his grip on the presentation remote before forcing another smile onto his face. It was the kind of smile executives practiced when they were angry but still trying to appear composed. "Prevent inaccurate reporting?" he repeated carefully. "That is a very serious accusation." "Evelyn," she nodded once. "Yes, it is." Several executives exchanged uneasy glances again. Brandon could feel the room beginning to shift away from him, even if only slightly, and his instincts immediately moved toward damage control. Men like Brandon survived by maintaining dominance. The moment fear disappeared, authority started cracking. He walked toward the center of the room again, straightening his jacket as he addressed the table instead of Evelyn directly now. "This company employs over 12,000 people nationwide," he said smoothly. "We process millions of dollars in operational logistics every week. Minor discrepancies happen constantly during preliminary audits." He paused intentionally before looking back toward Evelyn. Most experienced employees understand that. The insult landed exactly as intended, a subtle reminder that she was still beneath him, still small, still replaceable. But Evelyn did not lower her eyes. That unsettled him more than the accusation itself. She sat quietly beneath the cold white lights with her hands folded beside her laptop, calm in a way that made the executives around her increasingly uncomfortable. Brandon suddenly realized something dangerous. She was not afraid. He turned toward Human Resources Director Melissa Grant near the end of the table. "Melissa," he said casually, "perhaps we should discuss whether compliance staff should continue accessing unfinished executive reports without direct authorization." Melissa hesitated. "I believe Evelyn had approved audit clearance," she answered carefully. Brandon's jaw tightened slightly. He hated hesitation, especially public hesitation. "Approved by whom?" he asked sharply. Before Melissa could answer, Evelyn spoke again. "By the executive office." Brandon turned toward her immediately. "Excuse me?" Evelyn reached calmly into her folder and slid a printed authorization form onto the table. "My compliance access was expanded 2 months ago after the Denver distribution incident," she explained. "Executive authorization code was attached to the request." Brandon picked up the paper quickly. His eyes scanned the signature line, and for the briefest second, the color shifted in his face. The signature belonged to Jonathan Hale himself. Nobody missed the change. The room became even quieter. Brandon immediately placed the document back down as though it meant nothing. "Temporary clearance does not grant authority to challenge executive leadership during board review meetings," he snapped. Evelyn looked at him steadily. "I did not challenge leadership. I questioned altered timestamps." That word again, altered. Brandon felt pressure building behind his eyes now. The younger analysts around the room had stopped pretending to work entirely. Even senior executives were watching him carefully. He could feel control slipping inch by inch, and it terrified him more than he would ever admit aloud. "Enough," Brandon said firmly. "You are creating unnecessary confusion over preliminary reporting data you clearly do not fully understand." Evelyn slowly opened her laptop. The soft glow illuminated her calm expression, while the sound of keys clicking echoed lightly through the silent room. Brandon frowned immediately. "What are you doing?" Evelyn lifted her eyes toward the large presentation monitor mounted behind him. "Pulling the original archive logs," she answered softly. Brandon froze, not visibly enough for most people to recognize it, but enough for the tension in the room to tighten instantly. The air itself suddenly felt colder. One executive removed his glasses slowly. Another leaned forward in his chair. Brandon took a single step toward Evelyn, his voice dropping lower now, dangerous, controlled. "I do not remember giving you permission to access operational archives during my meeting." Evelyn met his stare without flinching. "It stopped being only your meeting the moment the numbers stopped matching." The room went completely silent. Brandon Pierce stared at Evelyn Carter for several long seconds without speaking. The polished confidence that usually controlled every room he entered had started slipping beneath the cold, fluorescent lights of conference room Atlas, and everyone around the table could feel it. The city skyline reflected against the glass walls, while tension settled over the executives like heavy smoke. Evelyn remained seated calmly beside her open laptop, the pale blue glow illuminating the printed audit files spread neatly in front of her. Brandon slowly inhaled through his nose before forcing himself to smile again. But this time, the smile looked strained. "You know what I think," he said suddenly, turning toward the executives around the table. "I think we are wasting valuable leadership time entertaining conspiracy theories from someone whose responsibilities involve filing compliance summaries." A few uneasy chuckles surfaced around the room, but they faded quickly. Nobody sounded convinced anymore. Brandon walked back toward the front display screen and pressed the remote harder than necessary. A new operational graph appeared behind him. "This," he announced sharply, "is exactly why internal staff are not included in executive-level decision-making. People see partial information and suddenly imagine themselves investigators." Evelyn quietly clicked another file open on her laptop. "The information is complete," she said softly. Brandon's jaw tightened again. He was beginning to lose patience completely now. "Enough!" His voice cracked louder across the room this time. Several employees flinched. "You are not senior leadership, Evelyn. You are not legal counsel. And you are certainly not qualified to accuse this department of data manipulation during a board review meeting." Evelyn looked toward the executives instead of Brandon now. "I did not accuse anyone," she replied calmly. "I documented inconsistencies." Brandon laughed sharply under his breath. "Documented?" He repeated the word like an insult. Then he suddenly leaned both hands against the conference table and lowered his voice. "Do you have any idea what happens when someone spreads unsupported allegations inside a corporation this size?" Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Brandon's eyes remained locked on Evelyn now with open hostility beneath the polished executive composure. "Careers collapse," he continued quietly. "Reputations disappear overnight. Entire departments become unstable because one employee decides she wants attention." Evelyn remained completely still. That silence only made Brandon more aggressive. Men who built power through intimidation often became reckless the moment intimidation stopped working. "Perhaps," Brandon said coldly, "human resources should review whether your role here remains appropriate after this meeting." Melissa Grant shifted in her chair immediately. "Brandon," she said carefully, "maybe we should slow down before discussing personnel action." Brandon turned toward her sharply. "Why? Because someone with temporary clearance opened a spreadsheet?" Melissa did not answer. The room had already changed too much. Brandon could feel it. His authority no longer dominated the atmosphere the way it had at the beginning of the meeting, and panic was beginning to creep beneath his polished exterior. He turned back toward Evelyn. "Let me ask you something directly," he said. "Did you intentionally access executive archive logs without authorization from operations leadership?" Evelyn answered immediately. "No." Brandon narrowed his eyes. "Then who authorized it?" Evelyn slowly rotated her laptop screen toward the center of the table. "The Executive Office Archive permissions are attached to every access request," she answered softly. Brandon looked at the screen. The room collectively leaned closer. A timestamp appeared beside the archive access authorization. Below it sat a digital executive signature approval tied directly to Jonathan Hale's office credentials. Brandon felt his stomach tighten instantly. He tried not to show it, but the executives nearest him noticed the sudden loss of color in his face. One senior board member slowly removed his glasses while studying the screen. Another executive quietly exchanged glances with Melissa Grant. Brandon straightened quickly. "Executive authorization does not excuse misconduct during a board meeting," he snapped. Evelyn closed the laptop halfway. "Then perhaps we should let the executive office decide whether it was misconduct." The room went silent again. Somewhere beyond the conference room walls, a distant elevator bell chimed softly across the executive floor. And for the first time that morning, Brandon Pierce looked genuinely nervous. The silence hanging over conference room Atlas had changed completely now. Earlier, it had been the silence of discomfort, the nervous quiet that followed public humiliation. But now it felt different. Heavier. Dangerous. Brandon Pierce stood near the front display screen with his shoulders rigid beneath his tailored navy suit, while executives around the table avoided looking directly at him. The massive windows surrounding the room reflected pale winter sunlight across the marble floors, but the atmosphere inside felt cold enough to drain warmth from the air itself. Evelyn Carter slowly closed her laptop halfway and folded her hands again. She had not raised her voice once since the meeting began. She had not argued emotionally. She had simply continued answering every accusation with calm facts, and somehow that frightened Brandon more than open confrontation ever could. He cleared his throat sharply and forced another professional smile toward the executives seated around the table. "Let us regain perspective here," he announced. "This meeting was scheduled to review quarterly operational performance, not entertain procedural misunderstandings from compliance support staff." Nobody responded immediately. Brandon noticed that too. Normally, the room moved with him. People nodded when he spoke. They laughed at the right moments. They followed his lead instinctively because fear made corporate loyalty easy. But now several executives were studying the documents in front of them instead of watching him. Melissa Grant remained unusually quiet. Even the junior analyst sitting near the back wall had stopped typing entirely. Brandon felt pressure building beneath his collar. "I think," he continued carefully, "we all understand how easy it is for someone unfamiliar with executive reporting systems to misinterpret internal revisions." Evelyn lifted her eyes toward him again. "The archive logs were not revisions," she said softly. "The original timestamps were overwritten." Brandon slammed the presentation remote onto the table harder than intended. The sharp crack echoed across the conference room and made several people jump slightly in their chairs. Realizing he had lost composure for a split second, Brandon immediately straightened his posture again. "You are crossing a line," he said quietly. Evelyn did not react. "No," she answered calmly. "I crossed the line 3 days ago when I discovered the discrepancies and chose to stay silent overnight while verifying the files instead of reporting incomplete information." The room became still again. Brandon stared at her. Something about the way she spoke unsettled him deeply now. There was no hesitation in her voice anymore, no uncertainty. It was as though she had already accepted whatever consequences came next. And people who no longer feared consequences were very difficult to control. Brandon suddenly walked toward the far end of the table and stopped directly beside her chair. "Let me explain something to you, Evelyn," he said softly enough that the room had to strain to hear him. "Corporations survive because people understand hierarchy. Employees who create unnecessary instability do not last long here." Evelyn slowly looked up at him. "Integrity matters more than hierarchy." Several executives visibly reacted to that sentence. One senior board advisor leaned back slowly, while another removed his glasses again, watching Brandon carefully now instead of Evelyn. Brandon realized he was losing the room completely. Panic flickered beneath his expression for only a second, but it was enough. "Fine," he snapped suddenly, stepping away from her chair. "If you believe these accusations deserve executive review, then we will involve executive review." He turned toward Melissa Grant. "Contact Legal and Human Resources immediately after this meeting. I want a full investigation opened into unauthorized archive access and disruptive conduct." Melissa hesitated. "Brandon, immediately," he repeated sharply. The room fell silent once more. Evelyn looked down at her laptop for a moment before calmly pressing a single key. A soft notification sound echoed through the room speakers connected to the executive system. Brandon frowned instantly. "What did you just do?" Evelyn looked toward the conference room doors. I finalized the archive escalation request. Brandon's face slowly lost color. You escalated this? Evelyn nodded once. Directly to the executive office. The entire room froze. Then, from somewhere beyond the glass walls of the executive floor, came the quiet sound of approaching footsteps. The sound of approaching footsteps outside conference room Atlas seemed to drain the remaining confidence from Brandon Pierce's face. The executives seated around the black conference table turned instinctively toward the glass doors, while the tension inside the room tightened like a wire ready to snap. Evelyn Carter remained seated quietly beside her half-closed laptop, her expression calm beneath the cold white lights overhead. Brandon stared at her now with something far different from irritation. It was fear, real fear, because men like Brandon understood one thing better than anyone else. Power only existed until someone higher walked into the room. The footsteps grew closer across the marble hallway outside, slow, controlled, deliberate. Then they stopped. For one suspended second, nobody moved. Nobody even breathed loudly. Brandon immediately adjusted his tie and straightened his jacket again, trying desperately to regain composure before the conference room doors opened. But it was already too late. The atmosphere had shifted beyond his control. Evelyn quietly clicked another file open on her laptop while the executives watched her with growing unease. Brandon noticed the movement instantly. "What exactly did you send to the executive office?" he demanded. Evelyn answered without emotion. "The original warehouse audit records, timestamp discrepancies, archive modifications, and authorization logs." Brandon's face tightened. "Without operations approval." Evelyn slowly looked up at him. "The escalation protocol does not require departmental approval when archive integrity is compromised." The room fell silent again. Brandon opened his mouth to respond, but no words came immediately. For the first time that morning, the operations director looked like a man struggling to think clearly. He glanced around the table searching for support, but nobody met his eyes anymore. Melissa Grant avoided looking at him entirely now. One executive quietly pushed the operational reports farther away from himself as though he no longer wanted to touch them. Brandon suddenly laughed under his breath, but the sound felt forced. Hollow. "This is unbelievable," he muttered. A compliance coordinator creates panic over routine revisions, escalates confidential files directly to the executive office, and somehow everyone here suddenly forgets basic corporate procedure. Evelyn closed her laptop completely this time. "No," she said softly. "Everyone here remembers procedure very clearly. That is why nobody is comfortable anymore." Brandon stared at her. The calmness in her voice unsettled him more with every passing minute. He had spent years mastering intimidation inside these walls. He knew how to pressure nervous employees, how to embarrass analysts, how to silence people with rank and authority. But Evelyn refused to react the way he expected. She never defended herself emotionally, never raised her voice, never begged, and that quiet dignity was slowly dismantling him in front of the entire executive board. Brandon took a slow breath and attempted one final recovery. "Let me make this absolutely clear," he announced loudly, turning back toward the room. "Operational leadership cannot function if employees start bypassing executive hierarchy every time they misunderstand internal reporting systems. If this behavior becomes acceptable, this company loses structure entirely." No one answered. Brandon could hear the soft hum of the projector behind him and the distant rumble of traffic 30 stories below. Then suddenly, a small notification appeared on the large presentation screen connected to the executive network. "Executive access verified. Live review active." The room froze instantly. Brandon slowly turned toward the screen. His face lost what little color remained. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. She already knew what the notification meant. Somewhere inside the building, someone from the executive office was now actively monitoring the meeting feed in real time. Brandon swallowed hard before forcing another strained smile. "This does not prove wrongdoing," he said quickly. Executive review happens all the time. But nobody believed him anymore. The executives around the table had become perfectly still. They could sense something approaching, something final. Then, without warning, the conference room doors unlocked with a soft electronic click. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance at the exact same moment. And Brandon Pierce stopped breathing for half a second when he saw who was standing outside the glass doors. Jonathan Hale stood outside the glass conference room doors, with one hand resting calmly in the pocket of his charcoal overcoat, while two executive legal advisors remained several steps behind him in the hallway. The moment, the executives inside recognized him. Every person around the table instinctively straightened in their seats. At 53, the founder and chief executive officer of Hale Dynamics carried none of Brandon Pierce's theatrical arrogance. He did not need it. Real authority rarely announced itself loudly. It simply entered the room and changed the oxygen inside it. The electronic doors slid open softly. Jonathan stepped inside without rushing, his polished black shoes crossing the marble floor with measured calm while complete silence swallowed the room. Brandon immediately forced himself upright. "Jonathan," he said quickly, attempting a professional smile. "We were just discussing an internal reporting misunderstanding." Jonathan did not answer him immediately. His sharp gray eyes moved slowly across the conference table, taking in the scattered audit reports, the frozen executives, the giant presentation screen still glowing behind Brandon, and finally Evelyn Carter sitting quietly near the far end of the table. She was the only person in the room who did not look nervous. Jonathan noticed that immediately. He removed his coat slowly and handed it to one of the legal advisors before speaking for the first time. "Sit down," he said calmly. Nobody hesitated. Chairs moved instantly across the room. Brandon swallowed hard before lowering himself back into his seat at the head of the table. Jonathan remained standing for another moment, studying the operational projections displayed behind him. "I reviewed the escalation package personally," he said at last. The room became perfectly still. Brandon tried to recover quickly. "Jonathan, with respect, this situation has been exaggerated. Compliance staff accessed unfinished operational revisions and misinterpreted." Jonathan raised one hand slightly. Brandon stopped talking immediately. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Jonathan turned toward the large screen and pressed a control button built into the conference table. The operational presentation disappeared. In its place appeared a detailed audit timeline filled with archive access logs, timestamp records, revision histories, and internal authorization signatures. Several executives visibly stiffened as the data expanded across the screen. Brandon's face slowly drained of color. Jonathan looked toward the room calmly. "These are the original archive records from the Denver distribution reports," he said. "The same records submitted through executive escalation 12 minutes ago." Nobody spoke. Jonathan clicked another file open. Two timestamps appeared side by side. One original, one modified. The discrepancy was impossible to ignore now. Archive modifications were executed 48 hours after the initial compliance lock. Jonathan continued quietly. Authorization credentials were rerouted through operations leadership clearance. Brandon leaned forward immediately. "Jonathan, there is context missing from those revisions." Jonathan finally looked directly at him, then explained why the modifications removed projected loss exposure from the board report. Brandon opened his mouth, but nothing came out immediately. The executives around the table exchanged tense glances. Melissa Grant slowly lowered her eyes toward the documents in front of her. Jonathan pressed another button. A series of internal emails appeared next. Brandon recognized them instantly. His stomach tightened. The emails showed direct instructions delaying disclosure of warehouse distribution losses until after quarterly performance reviews. One message carried Brandon's executive credentials. Another included instructions to suppress audit escalation temporarily. The room went completely silent. Brandon's breathing became visibly uneven now. "This was a procedural decision," he said carefully. "Not misconduct." Jonathan stared at him without expression. "Procedural decisions do not involve altering compliance timestamps." Brandon looked around the room desperately now, searching for someone to support him, but nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Fear had shifted directions completely. Jonathan finally turned toward Evelyn. His voice softened slightly for the first time since entering the room. "When did you discover the archive inconsistencies?" Evelyn answered calmly, "3 days ago." "And why did you wait before escalating?" Evelyn folded her hands quietly beside her laptop. "Because accusations without verification destroy innocent people," she said softly. "I wanted proof before I involved the executive office." Jonathan studied her silently for a moment. Then he nodded once. Small, controlled, respectful. Brandon saw it happen. And in that instant, he realized the worst part of all of this was not the investigation. It was the fact that the chief executive officer trusted the quiet woman he had humiliated far more than he trusted him. Brandon Pierce could feel every pair of eyes in conference room Atlas fixed on him now, but none of those stares frightened him as much as Jonathan Hale's silence. The chief executive officer stood calmly beside the glowing presentation screen, while the audit records remained frozen across the display for the entire executive board to see. The city skyline shimmered faintly through the towering glass walls behind them. Yet inside the room, the atmosphere had become painfully still. Brandon tried to steady his breathing. "Jonathan," he said carefully, "these emails are being taken out of context." Jonathan did not respond immediately. He simply pressed another control on the conference table. A new set of documents appeared on the screen: internal loss projections, compliance warnings, delayed reporting notices. Each one connected directly back to operations leadership approval. Brandon's face tightened further with every file that appeared. Warehouse losses exceeded projected margins by $11.4 million, Jonathan said quietly. Yet the board presentation submitted last Thursday reduced exposure estimates to under $3 million. No one spoke. Several executives looked visibly stunned now. One board advisor slowly leaned back in his chair, while another removed his glasses again and rubbed a hand across his forehead. Brandon immediately shook his head. Those were temporary projections pending final review. Jonathan's expression never changed. Then why were archive timestamps altered after compliance lock? Brandon hesitated, only for a second. But in corporate rooms built on power and perception, a single second of hesitation could destroy years of authority. The reporting system automatically updates revision logs during operational adjustments. Brandon answered quickly. Evelyn quietly opened her laptop again. The soft glow reflected against her calm face while she typed only a few keys. Then another document appeared on the large presentation screen. This one carried system authentication records from Hale Dynamics' internal servers. The room went silent all over again. "Automatic revisions do not bypass compliance authentication protocols," Evelyn said softly. Brandon stared at the screen. His mouth opened slightly before closing again. The authentication trail showed manual executive override access tied directly to his credentials. Time-stamped, verified, logged. Jonathan finally turned toward him fully. "Did you manually authorize these revisions after compliance review?" Brandon swallowed hard. "I authorized temporary operational adjustments while we reviewed distribution recovery options." Jonathan took one slow step closer. "That is not what I asked." Brandon's breathing became uneven now. Everyone in the room could see it. The confidence that once filled every corner of the conference table had completely disappeared from him. "I was protecting the company," Brandon said quietly. Jonathan's eyes hardened slightly for the first time. "No," he answered calmly. "You were protecting quarterly optics." The words landed like concrete. Nobody moved. Nobody even looked away. Brandon suddenly turned toward the board members as though searching for support. Every executive in this room understands how damaging premature loss disclosures can become before recovery strategies are finalized. Still, no one defended him. Fear had vanished from the room, replaced by something colder: accountability. Brandon looked back toward Jonathan desperately. "I did what I believed was necessary for operational stability." Jonathan studied him silently for several long seconds. Then he glanced toward Evelyn again. "And while you were attempting to protect operational stability," he said quietly, "you publicly humiliated the one employee who followed proper escalation procedure." Brandon froze. Complete silence swallowed the room. Jonathan continued calmly. "You questioned her qualifications, threatened her position, attempted to involve human resources before verifying the evidence she presented." Brandon's face paled completely now. He tried to speak again, but Jonathan raised one hand slightly. Instantly, Brandon stopped. "Effective immediately," Jonathan said, his voice perfectly controlled. "Your executive system access is suspended pending full board investigation." The words seemed to suck the remaining air from the room. Brandon stared at him in disbelief. One of the executive legal advisors stepped forward quietly and placed a sealed document folder onto the conference table beside Brandon's seat. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Jonathan then turned calmly toward Evelyn Carter. She remained seated quietly beside her laptop, still wearing the same simple gray cardigan Brandon had mocked less than an hour earlier. Jonathan nodded toward her once. Respectfully, "Thank you for protecting this company when others chose not to." The room went completely silent. No one inside conference room Atlas moved for several long seconds after Jonathan Hale finished speaking. The executives remained frozen around the black conference table, while the operational audit records still glowed across the massive presentation screen behind them. Outside the glass walls, downtown Chicago continued moving beneath the gray winter sky, but inside the executive floor of Hale Dynamics, everything had changed. Brandon Pierce sat motionless in his chair, staring at the sealed investigation folder beside his hand, as though he still could not fully understand how quickly his authority had collapsed. Less than an hour earlier, he had controlled the room completely. Employees feared him. Executives followed him, and Evelyn Carter had simply been the quiet woman in the gray cardigan sitting near the end of the table. Now, nobody looked at Brandon the same way anymore. Jonathan Hale remained standing calmly near the center of the room, while the executive legal advisors quietly collected operational files from the table. No dramatic shouting followed, no public spectacle. Real consequences rarely arrived loudly. They arrived quietly, with signatures, silence, and the complete disappearance of power. Brandon finally looked toward Evelyn. His expression had lost all sharpness now. The arrogance was gone. So was the certainty. For the first time that morning, he looked small. "Evelyn," he said carefully, his voice lower than anyone in the room had ever heard it before. "If there was a misunderstanding in how this situation escalated," Jonathan interrupted without raising his voice. "This situation escalated because integrity was treated as insubordination." The room fell silent again. Brandon lowered his eyes immediately. Nobody defended him. Nobody even attempted to soften what had happened, because every person around that table knew the truth now. The quiet employee he had tried to humiliate had protected the company, while senior leadership failed to do so honestly. Jonathan turned toward the board members calmly. "A full review of operational reporting procedures begins today," he announced. "Any executive interference with compliance audits will be grounds for immediate termination moving forward." Several executives nodded quickly. Fear had shifted again, but this time it was no longer fear of humiliation. It was fear of accountability. Jonathan then looked toward Evelyn once more. "Your escalation followed protocol exactly," he said, "and your restraint likely prevented far greater damage to this company." Evelyn gave a small nod. "I was only doing my job." That answer seemed to affect the room more than any speech could have, because she meant it. There was no pride in her voice, no revenge, No satisfaction at watching Brandon lose power in front of everyone. She had never wanted humiliation, only honesty. Jonathan studied her for a moment before speaking again. "Most people protect themselves first," he said quietly. "You protected the truth first." Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. The company deserved accurate reporting. A hush settled over the room. Even the executives who barely noticed her existence before this morning now watched her differently. Respect had replaced dismissal. One by one, people who had remained silent during Brandon's attacks slowly avoided looking at Evelyn out of guilt. They remembered how easily they had allowed someone quieter and lower ranked to stand alone. Jonathan finally stepped toward the conference room doors before pausing beside Evelyn's chair. "Human Resources will discuss your promotion package later this week," he said calmly. Several executives looked stunned again. Evelyn blinked softly, clearly caught off guard for the first time all morning. "Sir, that is not necessary." Jonathan gave the faintest hint of a smile. "Integrity at this company is necessary." Then he walked out of the room. The legal advisors followed behind him while silence lingered across the executive floor long after the doors closed. Evelyn slowly gathered her audit files and placed her laptop carefully into her bag. Nobody stopped her. Nobody questioned her anymore. As she stood to leave, several executives quietly moved aside to clear a path for her through the room. Respectfully. And that morning, inside a glass conference room overlooking Chicago, an entire executive board learned something power alone could never teach them. Authority may command fear for a while, but dignity, honesty, and quiet courage leave a far deeper mark long after the room falls silent.